Mana Whenua, and I'm pretty sure this one was rolled over from the operative Isthmus district plan. Summary of the submitters' views. So we had 370 sites requested to be added to either of the schedules. We don't have the breakdown of how many were to the site of significance versus the site of value, because some of the submitters just asked to give them greater protection through adding them to the schedules. So we don't have a clear split. In many cases it was an either or, in a few cases it was just a one or the other, but the bulk were just saying add these 377 sites to the unitary plan and protect them. There were 147 submissions seeking changes to the rules around the sites and places of significance to address specific activities or to simplify the provisions. Many of the submissions related to earthworks for infrastructure, asking for a bit more flexibility for infrastructure where infrastructure passes through these sites. And submissions from Mana Whenua generally sought the retention of this overlay and the provisions or the rules, if you like, as notified. Council's position at the hearings was to retain this overlay, the sites and places of significance to Mana Whenua, subject to amending the list of activities that require consent. So there was a proposed amendment to permit activities that won't result in additional adverse effects. For example, altering a building that doesn't change the footprint of the building. It was agreed by Council that our position at the hearing, Council's position should be that that should be a permitted activity, and certain changes of use within a building should be a permitted activity. So in the notified plan, those alterations, even if they didn't increase the footprint of the building, were required consent. So there was a change there. Some tidying up of the inconsistencies and refining thresholds for consent to provide greater certainty. Enabling infrastructure where the effects on cultural heritage can be avoided, remedied or mitigated. Council supported requests for additional sites in principle, subject to more information being provided on their location and extent, so we could actually map them in the unitary plan. But the ultimate position of Council was that no sites should be added. We simply didn't have sufficient information to map and identify these sites. But obviously those submitters had the opportunity to present the case to the panel, and the panel may accept or recommend to Council that additional sites should be added, but clearly there's an ongoing need for discussions with Mana Whenua around these nominations for additional sites, and that is taking place as part of the Maori Cultural Heritage Program. So if we move on to sites in place of value to Mana Whenua, these sites were identified by the Council and included in the unitary plan based on archaeological records of sites of Maori origin. 3,600 sites were included in the plan as notified. You'll be familiar with a lot of the stuff. They have the 200 diameter purple circle in the plan, and the only trigger for resource consent was earthworks. So unlike the sites of significance that were largely rolled over from the operative plans, which require consent for a range of things, including alterations and additions and so on, the only activity that required a consent within the purple circles was earthworks. So I guess less restrictive in that sense than the sites of significance, but far more of them. And we have our example here, jumping back to in the vicinity of Pukaki Crater, Pukaki Stream and Waikari Stream. So we've got the image there, and you can just see from the unitary plan, it's the purple circles here. These have the 200 diameter, and they're based on archaeological records in this location. So interestingly, in the unitary plan, there's no site of significance identified in this area here. The protection has been introduced through these purple circles, the sites of value to Mana Whenua. So just an overview of the submissions. Mana Whenua and the Independent Māori Statutory Board supported the overlay. There were requests for 370, I've mentioned this before, this is a mix of either sites of significance or sites of value, mainly from Mana Whenua. Approximately 380 submissions sought deletions to either the whole overlay or specific sites. and a number of submissions sought that the overlay is replaced by a non-statutory alert layer, so it wouldn't trigger the need for a resource consent. It would just be some information sitting in the council system that if an applicant is applying for a development and needs a consent anyway, there's some information there that the council could potentially rely on, or an applicant could potentially take into account. But it wouldn't have the effect of being a rule and requiring consent. Council's position at the hearing was to retain the overlay, but to remove a total of 1,387 sites, which would leave 2,213 in the plan. The reason why officers recommended that these sites, at the council's case at the hearing, should be that they're removed, is that 73 sites were identified as either non-Māori or duplicates. 752 sites, we didn't have any information from mana whenua to specifically identify cultural value for the site. 10, it was very unclear from the archaeological records whether it was archaeology or just a natural feature, so the archaeologist hadn't really formed a view on that, and yet they were in the plan. And there were 552 sites where we didn't have an accurate location when we looked into the records in a lot more detail off the back of submissions. So Council also proposed amendments to make more accurate the location of 307 sites, and the circles identifying the location of the sites, the proposal before the panel was to reduce them to a radius of 50 metres as opposed to 100 metres, and to delete the reference to any buffer, so anything outside of the circle wouldn't require a consent under this overlay. Subsequent to Council's case before the panel, there was, as you may recall, an Auckland Development Committee resolution to immediately withdraw sites from the unitary plan, and that was the resolution there. It was to agree to remove the sites on private land until such time as those sites have an accurate location, and those sites have been removed from the unitary plan already at this point in time, so there's an added complication there in that part of the plan has actually been removed. And lastly, just related to the sites of significance and the sites of value, cultural impact assessments. CIAs are required for certain types of resource consents under the notified version of the plan. There were 15 or so broad categories: discharging to air, land and water, reclamation, diverting rivers or streams, taking water, disturbing the seabed, mineral extraction, and lastly, the sites and places of significance and sites and places of mana whenua triggered the requirement for a cultural impact assessment to be prepared. However, the notified plan did also enable discussion with mana whenua, where mana whenua could confirm that in a particular case a CIA is not required, and therefore the resource consent can continue to be processed without a CIA. If an applicant refused to engage with mana whenua or provide a cultural impact assessment, then the application would become a full discretionary application, and at that point the council itself could commission a cultural impact assessment or assessment. So that's the notified plan and CIAs. Submitters' views on the CIAs: approximately 850 submission points, some seeking to retain, amend or delete the provisions. Many were requesting that the entire section or parts of it were deleted. However, there was also strong support for the cultural impact assessment approach. Some were concerned that the process wasn't that clear in terms of who engages with mana whenua, how does that take place, what happens if a CIA isn't provided. And amendments were sought to those triggers, that list there of 15 or so broad categories. So there were specific changes requested to some of those. Council's position at the hearings on the cultural impact assessments were to support the requirement for a CIA for a range of activities, but to clarify that the cultural impact assessment is not a rule in the unitary plan. It's information that's required when other things trigger the need for resource consent. For example, discharging stormwater to the Manukau Harbour requires a consent under the unitary plan. As part of that, there's information required, which is a cultural impact assessment. It's a bit of a subtle difference, but it's saying that it's not a rule. It's information that you need if you're discharging to the harbours. If you're modifying a site of significance to mana whenua, it's information that's required. It's not a rule in itself. There was revisions to the plan to clarify the process, that it's documenting the engagement with mana whenua on how the effects of a development could be avoided, remedied or mitigated. And there were some refinements to that list of categories that require a cultural impact assessment as part of the information. And the process associated with the CIAs was worked through in mediation between the council and submitters, and there was large agreement between council and mana whenua and a number of others on some of the changes to the CIA provisions. So really 3 parts to that presentation, Madam Chair, and that's the overview of Māori cultural heritage and mana whenua sites.
Well traversed. Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thanks. I get a lot of questions about this one, John, as you can well imagine, out in the rural blocks. So what constitutes earthworks?
Been extensive discussions at a number of the hearings on defining exactly what constitutes earthworks. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't really want to give you a specific. I think it's something we'll have to provide you with a bit more detail. I mean, there's the obvious things like digging foundations for a building, but then you get into things like cultivation and things like that, whether that, I'm pretty sure that cultivation is, but then you get into areas like forestry, is removing, as you're removing a tree, damaging the earth. I think you're aware there has been extensive discussion around that. We landed on a definition as part of Council's case of what earthworks is, and it's probably best we circulate that and maybe have further questions at the next meeting. Yeah. Probably as good as I can do at this point.
Yeah.
Unless, yeah.
Scope, type,
Marilyn?
scale.
Okay, so Marilyn was our lead on earthworks. So I'll see if Marilyn can give a better explanation at this point, and then maybe we circulate the definition that Council agreed on for earthworks.
Thanks, John. The definition of earthworks was proposed to be amended to refer to land disturbance through the 041 topic. So the definition of land disturbance is the disturbance of the surface of land by earthworks, ancillary farming earthworks or ancillary forestry earthworks. And we have 3 subsets, so earthworks, which is the more traditional development earthworks, and then ancillary farming earthworks has got a separate definition, and ancillary forestry earthworks has a separate definition.
So all of those potentially require a resource consent and a CIA.
Where they hit
Where they hit that barrier.
the site of significance, which is only the
50 metres.
60 odd, but the 50 metre site of value to mana whenua, yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Councillor Casey. I'm just trying to get my head around the sites of value, and in particular how that resolution of the Auckland Development Committee affects sites where there's half of it on private land and half of it on public land. And what does it mean until such time as? Is there a time frame on that? I mean, are we going back to them within the time frame of the unitary plan?
So the first question around the public and private land, the approach is if they are partly on private land, then they have been removed. So if any part of the site is on private land, even if part of it is on public land.
That's what I mean, so you could have half a site protected and the other half not.
Yeah.
Yep. But if you look at that Point Chev one, just as an example, I know that was not in one
That's
of these.
a site of significance, so that's safe.
I know
yeah.
it is,
But
I'm
for
just saying
example,
there's an example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's probably
A good one.
yeah, if we imagine that was a circle,
Yeah.
not a rectangle.
Yeah.
The entire site has now been removed from the unitary plan because our interpretation of the resolution is that it's on private land.
So any site that had a bit of it in private land's gone,
Has gone, yeah.
despite
Where there isn't an accurate location. So these sites were always a subset of the council's case before the panel. It's the private land subset of council's case before the panel. So the removal of these was consistent with the council's approach at the hearings. It's a subset of council's approach at the hearings. It's a smaller number. but they have been immediately removed before the panel has made its recommendations,
Right,
which is
but-
the only instance we have of that, apart from a thermal power station in Rodney. I think there was also removal of a part of the unitary plan, but yeah.